In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away, leaving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. Margaret Maggie Thompson lived in a modest farmhouse 3 miles from Camp Perry, where she had spent the last 37 years of her life raising 4 children and helping her husband run a small dairy operation. To anyone who met her, she seemed like the most ordinary woman imaginable. She stood barely 5 feet tall, wore simple house dresses, and spoke with the gentle accent of rural Ohio. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a practical bun, and her hands showed the wear of decades of farm work. What nobody knew, including her own family, was that Margaret Thompson possessed one of the most extraordinary natural shooting abilities anyone had ever seen. This hidden talent had developed during her childhood in the mountains of West Virginia, where her father had taught her to hunt out of necessity rather than sport. The Thompson family had been desperately poor, and Margaret's ability to bring home rabbits, squirrels, and occasional deer had often made the difference between eating and going hungry. Her father, William Patterson, had been a quiet man who believed that survival skills were more important than formal education. He had noticed Margaret's exceptional hand-eye coordination when she was just 6 years old, watching her throw stones with uncanny accuracy at crows bothering their small vegetable garden. By the time she was 8, he was teaching her to shoot with an old single-shot rifle that had belonged to his grandfather. What made Margaret special wasn't just her natural accuracy, though that was remarkable enough. She seemed to understand instinctively how wind, distance, temperature, and dozens of other factors affected a bullet's path. More importantly, she had an intuitive grasp of the mental side of shooting that even experienced marksmen struggled to master. She could calm her mind, control her breathing, and fire at the exact moment when everything aligned perfectly. By her teenage years, Margaret could consistently hit targets that grown men with years of experience would miss. But this was Depression-era West Virginia, where such skills were taken for granted rather than celebrated. Women weren't expected to compete in shooting contests or show off their abilities. Margaret's talent was simply a practical tool for helping her family survive. Nothing more. When she married Robert Thompson in 1941 and moved to Ohio, Margaret had left her rifle behind and assumed she would never shoot again. Robert was a good man who provided for his family through honest work, and there was no need for her to hunt. She adapted to her new life as a farm wife, focusing on raising children and supporting her husband's dairy business. For 15 years, she had barely thought about shooting, letting her extraordinary skills lie dormant. But Margaret's neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Davies, had noticed something unusual about her quiet friend. Eleanor's husband worked at Camp Perry as a civilian maintenance supervisor, and he often came home with stories about the military's mysterious marksmanship problems. One evening, as the 2 women sat on Margaret's front porch snapping green beans, Eleanor mentioned the troubles at the base. "Frank says those poor boys can't hit the side of a barn," Eleanor said, shaking her head sympathetically. "They brought in all sorts of experts, but nothing seems to help. The colonel in charge looks like he's about to have a nervous breakdown." Margaret listened quietly, her hands never pausing in their work with the beans. Something about the story troubled her, though she couldn't put her finger on what it was. That night she found herself thinking about her father's old lessons, remembering the quiet wisdom he had shared during their hunting trips in the West Virginia hills. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. She walked to the old barn behind her house and climbed up to the loft, where Robert stored hay and old farm equipment. Hidden behind a stack of moldy burlap sacks, she found the wooden crate she had packed 15 years earlier when she left West Virginia. Inside, carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, was her father's rifle. The weapon was a modified Springfield 1903, similar to the military rifles but customized by a local gunsmith who had understood the needs of Appalachian hunters. Margaret lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar weight and balance. Even after all these years, it felt like an extension of her own body. That afternoon, while Robert was in town and the children were at school, Margaret set up some tin cans on fence posts behind the barn. She loaded 5 cartridges that she had found in the bottom of the crate, cartridges that were probably 15 years old but still looked serviceable. Standing 50 yards away, she raised the rifle and felt a familiar calm settle over her mind. The first shot rang out across the quiet farmland, and the leftmost can disappeared. 4 more shots followed in quick succession, and 4 more cans vanished. Margaret lowered the rifle and smiled for the first time in weeks. Her gift was still there, undimmed by years of disuse. But hitting stationary cans wasn't what made Margaret special. Over the next several days, she began to experiment, setting up increasingly difficult shots to test the limits of her ability. She shot cans at 200 yards, then 300, then 400. She tried shooting in different wind conditions at different times of day, and from various positions. Every shot found its mark. More importantly, Margaret began to think seriously about what she had observed in her years of shooting. She remembered her father's teachings, but also the insights she had developed on her own. She thought about the way her mind worked when she was shooting at her best, the subtle adjustments she made automatically, and the mistakes she had seen other hunters make. Margaret realized that most people approach shooting as a purely mechanical skill, focusing on sight alignment, trigger control, and the technical aspects of marksmanship. But in her experience, the mental side was far more important. A shooter who was tense, distracted, or trying too hard would miss no matter how perfect their technique appeared to be. She began to formulate ideas about what might be going wrong at Camp Perry. Military training, by its very nature, created pressure and stress. Soldiers were constantly being evaluated, criticized, and pushed to perform. This environment might be exactly the opposite of what was needed for accurate shooting. For several weeks, Margaret continued her private practice sessions, refining her theories and testing different approaches. She began to develop a systematic understanding of what she had always done instinctively. She could explain not just how to shoot accurately, but why certain mental states produced better results than others. The turning point came when Eleanor Davies mentioned that the military was becoming desperate enough to consider bringing in civilian consultants. Frank says they're even talking about asking local hunters for advice, Eleanor said with a laugh. Can you imagine? The mighty U.S. Army asking regular folks for help? Margaret didn't laugh. Instead, she spent that entire night sitting at her kitchen table writing down everything she understood about shooting. She filled page after page with observations, techniques, and insights that she had never shared with anyone. By dawn, she had created what amounted to a complete manual on the mental aspects of marksmanship. The next morning, Margaret Thompson made the most courageous decision of her quiet life. She put on her best dress, pinned her hair up carefully, and walked the 3 miles to Camp Perry. She was going to offer her help to Colonel Mitchell, though she had no idea whether he would take her seriously or laugh her off the base. As she approached the main gate, Margaret could hear the sound of rifle fire from the training ranges. But she could also hear something else, the frustrated voices of men who couldn't understand why their best efforts were failing. She clutched her handwritten notes tightly and prepared to change the course of American military history. The young guard at the Camp Perry main gate looked confused when Margaret Thompson approached him that crisp October morning. She hardly looked like someone who belonged on a military base, carrying a small purse and wearing a simple blue dress that she had sewn herself. When she politely asked to speak with Colonel Mitchell about the marksmanship training program, the guard's first instinct was to politely turn her away. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but Colonel Mitchell is very busy," the guard said kindly. "If you have a complaint about noise from the firing ranges, I can direct you to the Public Relations Office." Margaret smiled patiently. She had expected this reaction. "I'm not here to complain, young man. I'm here to help. I believe I might have some insights that could be useful to the Colonel's training program." The guard looked even more confused. This small, middle-aged farm wife wanted to help solve the military's marksmanship crisis? He was about to politely refuse again when Sergeant Rodriguez happened to walk by on his way back from another frustrating morning at the firing range. Rodriguez had heard enough about civilian experts and consultants to last a lifetime. But something about the woman's quiet confidence caught his attention. Unlike the academics and self-proclaimed experts who had paraded through Camp Perry over the past months, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She just stood there calmly, as if she had all the time in the world. "What kind of insights, ma'am?" Rodriguez asked, approaching the gate. Margaret looked at the sergeant's frustrated expression and recognized something familiar. "You're having trouble with your shooting, aren't you? Not because you don't know how to shoot, but because something about the training environment is interfering with your natural ability." Rodriguez stopped dead in his tracks. This was exactly what he had been feeling but couldn't put into words. How did you know that? Because I've been watching and thinking about this problem, Margaret replied, and I believe I might understand what's going wrong. Sergeant Rodriguez made a decision that would change military history. Ma'am, I think Colonel Mitchell should hear what you have to say. 20 minutes later, Margaret found herself sitting in Colonel Mitchell's spartanly furnished office, facing a man who looked like he hadn't slept well in months. The colonel listened politely as she introduced herself, but she could see the skepticism in his eyes. He had dealt with too many well-meaning civilians who thought they understood military training better than career soldiers. Mrs. Thompson, Colonel Mitchell said carefully, I appreciate your desire to help, but we've consulted with numerous experts over the past several months. Our problems are quite complex and technical in nature. Margaret nodded understandingly. Colonel, may I ask you something? When you were learning to shoot as a young man, where did you do your best practicing? The question caught Mitchell off guard. Well, I learned to hunt with my grandfather in Pennsylvania. We spent hours in the woods, just the two of us. And how did you feel during those times? Mitchell paused, remembering. Peaceful, I suppose, relaxed. It was like meditation in a way. Now, Margaret continued gently, how do your men feel when they're training here? The colonel's expression began to change as he understood where she was heading. They're under constant pressure. Being evaluated, timed, scored, criticized when they miss. Exactly, Margaret said. And how can a man shoot peacefully when he's anything but peaceful? For the first time in months, Colonel Mitchell felt like someone might actually understand the problem. Go on, he said, leaning forward. Margaret opened her purse and pulled out the pages of notes she had written. Colonel, I've been thinking about this for weeks. Your men aren't losing their shooting ability. They're just being prevented from using it properly. She began to explain her theory, drawing on decades of observation and experience. Military training, by its very nature, created an artificial environment that was counterproductive to accurate shooting. The constant evaluation, the pressure to perform, the competitive atmosphere between soldiers, the rigid adherence to technique over natural ability. All of these factors combined to create mental tension that made accurate shooting nearly impossible. But our training methods have been developed over decades, Colonel Mitchell protested. They're based on proven military doctrine. Proven for what? Margaret asked quietly. For creating soldiers who can follow orders and maintain discipline under pressure? Absolutely. But accurate shooting requires a completely different mental state. You're trying to force square pegs into round holes. Margaret went on to explain her observations about the mental aspects of marksmanship. She talked about the importance of natural breathing patterns, the need for a quiet mind, and the way that trying too hard could actually make performance worse. She described how the best shots happened when a shooter stopped thinking about technique and simply trusted their instincts. Colonel Mitchell found himself nodding as she spoke. Everything she said matched his own observations, but presented in a way that made sense of the chaos he had been experiencing. Mrs. Thompson, this is fascinating, but how do we apply it? We can't just tell our men to relax and hope for the best. No, but we can change how we approach their training, Margaret replied. Instead of creating more pressure, we need to create an environment where natural shooting ability can emerge. She outlined a completely different approach to marksmanship training. Instead of starting with strict technical instruction, soldiers would begin by simply shooting in a relaxed environment, focusing on enjoyment rather than performance. Instead of constant evaluation, there would be periods of practice without any scoring or criticism. Instead of competition between soldiers, there would be emphasis on personal improvement and mutual support. This sounds almost too simple, Colonel Mitchell said. The best solutions usually are, Margaret replied. Your men already know how to shoot. They wouldn't be here if they didn't have natural ability. The problem is that your training methods are interfering with that ability instead of enhancing it. Colonel Mitchell sat quietly for several minutes, processing what he had heard. Everything Margaret said made intuitive sense, but it went against everything he had been taught about military training. On the other hand, conventional methods weren't working, and he was rapidly running out of options. Mrs. Thompson, he said finally, would you be willing to demonstrate your approach with some of my men? Margaret felt a flutter of nervousness. It was one thing to theorize about shooting, quite another to actually prove her methods worked, but she had come this far, and she believed in what she was proposing. I'd be honored to try, Colonel. Good. But I have to warn you, these men are frustrated and skeptical. They've been promised solutions before, only to be disappointed. They won't be easy to convince, Margaret smiled. Colonel, I've raised 4 children and lived through the Depression. I think I can handle a few frustrated soldiers. Colonel Mitchell couldn't help but smile back. For the first time in months, he felt something that might have been hope. When can we start? How about this afternoon? Margaret said. And Colonel, I'd like to begin with your most frustrated marksman, the one who's having the worst time of it. That would be Sergeant Rodriguez. He's about ready to request a transfer. Perfect, Margaret said, standing up. He'll be ideal for what I have in mind. As Margaret left his office, Colonel Mitchell realized that he was about to embark on the most unconventional training experiment in military history. He was putting his career in the hands of a farm wife from Ohio who claimed she could solve problems that had stumped military experts for months. But as he watched her walk across the base with quiet confidence, something told him that Margaret Thompson might just be exactly what Camp Perry needed. Sergeant Rodriguez stood at the firing line that afternoon, his jaw clenched with barely controlled frustration. He had been told that a civilian woman was going to observe his shooting and offer suggestions, and the idea made him angry. Bad enough that he couldn't hit targets. That should have been easy for him. Now he was going to be critiqued by someone who probably had never fired a rifle in her life. Margaret Thompson approached the firing line quietly, carrying a simple wooden chair that she had borrowed from the base headquarters. She set it down about 10 feet behind Rodriguez and sat down without saying a word. For the next 20 minutes, she simply watched as the sergeant went through his standard practice routine. Rodriguez fired shot after shot, following the precise technique he had been taught. His stance was textbook perfect, his breathing controlled, his sight alignment exact, but shot after shot missed the center of the target, some by considerable margins. With each miss, Margaret could see the tension building in his shoulders and neck. "Sergeant," Margaret said quietly when he paused to reload, "would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Rodriguez turned around, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I don't think questions are going to help. I know what I'm supposed to do. I just can't seem to do it anymore." "I understand," Margaret said gently, "but humor me for a moment. When you were learning to shoot as a boy, where did you practice?" Rodriguez looked puzzled by the question. "In the desert behind my uncle's ranch in Texas. Why does that matter?" "And what was that like?" "It was—" Rodriguez paused, his expression softening slightly as he remembered. "It was quiet, peaceful. My uncle and I would go out in the early morning when the air was still. We'd take our time just enjoying being outdoors." "How did you feel when you were shooting then?" "Good," Rodriguez said, a note of longing creeping into his voice. "Relaxed. Like everything was right with the world." Margaret nodded. "And how do you feel when you're shooting here?" Rodriguez's face hardened again. "Like I'm being watched and judged every second. Like my whole career depends on every shot. Like everyone's waiting for me to fail." "And how's that working for you?" Margaret asked with a slight smile. Despite himself, Rodriguez almost smiled back. "Not too good, ma'am. Sergeant, would you be willing to try something different? Something that might seem a little strange?" Rodriguez looked around at the other soldiers who were practicing nearby, all struggling with the same problems he was facing. "Ma'am, at this point I'd try anything." Margaret stood up and moved closer to the firing line. "I want you to forget everything you've been taught about shooting technique for the next few minutes. Instead, I want you to close your eyes and remember that desert behind your uncle's ranch." "Ma'am, I don't understand." "Just trust me. Close your eyes and think about those early morning shooting sessions. Remember how the air felt, how quiet it was, how peaceful you felt." Rodriguez felt foolish, but he closed his eyes. Gradually, the sounds of the firing range faded as he focused on Margaret's voice. She guided him through a detailed visualization, helping him remember not just the place, but the feelings associated with those successful shooting experiences. "Now," Margaret said softly, "keep those feelings, but open your eyes and pick up your rifle." Rodriguez opened his eyes, and something was different. The firing range looked the same, but his perspective had changed. The tension in his shoulders had eased, and his breathing had naturally become deeper and more relaxed. "Don't think about technique," Margaret instructed. "Don't worry about what anyone else is thinking. Just shoot the way you did when you were a boy in the desert." Rodriguez raised his rifle, and for the first time in months it felt natural in his hands. He didn't think about sight alignment or breathing control or trigger squeeze. He simply aimed and fired, trusting the instincts he had developed years ago. The shot hit dead center. Rodriguez lowered his rifle and stared at the target in disbelief. "How did I do that?" "You stopped trying so hard," Margaret said. "You trusted your natural ability instead of fighting against it. But that goes against everything we've been taught about marksmanship." "Maybe what you've been taught is wrong," Margaret suggested gently. Rodriguez fired 4 more shots, maintaining the relaxed, natural approach Margaret had guided him toward. All 4 shots grouped tightly in the center of the target. By now, other soldiers had stopped their own practice to watch in amazement. Corporal Sullivan approached the firing line, his own rifle hanging forgotten at his side. "Rodriguez, what the hell are you doing different?" Before Rodriguez could answer, Margaret stepped forward. "Corporal, would you like to try the same approach?" Word spread quickly through the training facility that something unusual was happening at firing position number 3. Within an hour, a small crowd had gathered to watch as Margaret worked with one soldier after another. Her method was surprisingly simple. Instead of focusing on technical perfection, she helped each man reconnect with the natural shooting ability he already possessed. With Corporal Sullivan, she had him remember hunting trips with his father in the Montana mountains. With Private Kim, she guided him through memories of target shooting contests in California. Each soldier had different memories, but the pattern was always the same: peaceful settings, relaxed attitudes, and natural instinctive shooting. The results were dramatic. Men who had been struggling for months were suddenly shooting with accuracy that matched or exceeded their previous best performances. More importantly, the frustrated, tense atmosphere that had pervaded the training facility began to lift as soldiers rediscovered the joy of shooting. Well, Colonel Mitchell arrived at the firing range just as Private Kim was completing a perfect 10-shot group at 300 yards. The colonel had heard reports about what was happening, but seeing it for himself was still shocking. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, pulling her aside. "What exactly are you doing?" "I'm not doing anything, Colonel. I'm just helping your men stop interfering with their own natural abilities." Colonel Mitchell watched as another soldier, guided by Margaret's gentle coaching, fired a series of excellent shots. "This seems almost too easy. If the solution was this simple, why didn't we figure it out ourselves?" "Because sometimes we need fresh eyes to see obvious problems," Margaret replied. "You were also focused on improving technique that you forgot about the mental side of shooting. But technique without the right mental state is useless. So you're saying our entire training doctrine is wrong?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "Not wrong exactly, but incomplete. You're teaching men how to shoot, but you're not teaching them how to let themselves shoot well." As the afternoon progressed, word of the dramatic improvements reached the base command structure. General Blackwood himself arrived to observe the unusual training session, bringing with him several Pentagon officials who had been monitoring the marksmanship crisis. What they saw challenged everything they thought they knew about military training. A small farm wife from Ohio was achieving results with frustrated soldiers that months of intensive training by expert instructors had failed to produce. She wasn't using any special equipment or revolutionary techniques. She was simply helping soldiers remember what it felt like to shoot well. By the end of the day, every soldier who had worked with Margaret was shooting significantly better than he had in months. More importantly, they were enjoying shooting again, approaching the firing line with confidence rather than dread. But as word of Margaret's success spread, it also created new challenges. Some traditionalists in the military establishment were resistant to the idea that their training methods needed fundamental changes. Others worried that Margaret's approach was too unstructured and informal for military use. As Margaret packed up her notes that evening, Colonel Mitchell approached her with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Mrs. Thompson, what you've accomplished today is remarkable. But I have to ask, can this approach be systematized? Can it be taught to other instructors and implemented throughout the military?" Margaret smiled. "Colonel, that's exactly what we need to find out." The following weeks at Camp Perry were unlike anything in the facility's history. Margaret Thompson found herself at the center of a military training revolution, working 16-hour days to develop a systematic approach that could be implemented across the entire armed forces. The pressure was immense, but she thrived on the challenge of transforming her intuitive understanding into teachable methods. General Blackwood had given Colonel Mitchell 30 days to prove that Margaret's approach could work on a larger scale. If successful, it would be tested at military bases across the country. If it failed, the experiment would be quietly terminated, and traditional training methods would resume. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Margaret began by working with small groups of soldiers, carefully observing what worked and what didn't. She discovered that while her basic principle, helping soldiers access their natural shooting ability, remained constant, the specific techniques needed to be adapted for different personalities and backgrounds. Some soldiers responded well to visualization exercises, like Sergeant Rodriguez had. Others needed physical relaxation techniques to release the tension that was interfering with their shooting. Still others required confidence-building exercises to overcome the psychological damage done by months of failure and criticism. Margaret also realized that the military's existing instructor corps would need to be completely retrained. Most of the current instructors were excellent marksmen themselves, but they had been taught to focus exclusively on technical aspects of shooting. They had no understanding of the psychological factors that Margaret was addressing. The first major challenge came when Gunnery Sergeant Harold "Tank" Morrison, a 20-year veteran instructor, openly challenged Margaret's methods during a training session. Morrison was old-school military through and through, and he didn't believe that a civilian woman could teach him anything about marksmanship training. "Ma'am," Morrison said during a particularly tense moment, "all this talk about feelings and relaxation is fine for a civilian shooting club, but these men are training for combat. They need discipline and precision, not hand-holding." Margaret looked at the tough sergeant calmly. "Sergeant Morrison, may I ask you something? In combat, do you want your men to be tense and overthinking every shot, or do you want them to shoot naturally and instinctively?" "Instinctively, of course, but then we need to train their instincts, not suppress them," Margaret interrupted gently. "What do you think happens to a soldier's accuracy when he's terrified and overthinking in a firefight?" Morrison paused, considering the question. He had seen enough combat to know that soldiers who relied too heavily on memorized techniques often froze up when the shooting started. The best combat marksmen were those who could shoot without thinking about it. "Ma'am, I see your point, but how do we maintain military discipline and standards with your approach?" Margaret smiled. "Sergeant, I'm not suggesting we abandon discipline. I'm suggesting we discipline ourselves to train more effectively. The goal is still the same, creating excellent marksmen. We're just using better methods to get there." To prove her point, Margaret asked Morrison to demonstrate his own shooting for the group. The sergeant was indeed an excellent marksman, but Margaret could see the subtle signs of tension that were preventing him from shooting at his absolute best. "Sergeant, your technique is flawless," Margaret said after watching him fire several shots. "But I notice you're holding your breath a little too long and your grip is slightly tighter than it needs to be. May I suggest a small adjustment?" Morrison was skeptical, but he agreed to try Margaret's suggestions. Within minutes, his already excellent shooting improved noticeably. More importantly, he began to understand that Margaret wasn't trying to replace military discipline with civilian casualness. She was trying to make military training more effective. Word of Morrison's conversion to Margaret's method spread quickly through the instructor ranks. If Tank Morrison, the most traditional, hard-nosed instructor at Camp Perry, believed in what Margaret was teaching, then maybe there was something to it after all. But Margaret's biggest challenge wasn't convincing individual instructors. It was developing a training program that could be standardized and implemented consistently across different military units. The Army needed specific lesson plans, measurable objectives, and clear evaluation criteria that could be used by instructors who didn't have Margaret's intuitive understanding of shooting psychology. Margaret spent countless hours in Colonel Mitchell's office, working with military education specialists to create detailed training manuals. She had to translate concepts that came naturally to her into step-by-step procedures that could be followed by instructors with varying levels of experience and understanding. The process was frustrating for everyone involved. Military training manuals were typically precise and technical, filled with exact measurements, specific timing requirements, and detailed procedural steps. But Margaret's approach was more art than science, requiring instructors to read their students' emotional states and adapt their methods accordingly. "Mrs. Thompson," said Major William Davies, the base's chief training officer, "we need to be able to tell an instructor exactly what to do in every situation. We can't just say, help the soldier relax and hope for the best." Margaret understood the problem. but she also knew that overly rigid procedures would defeat the purpose of her approach. Major, teaching someone to shoot well is like teaching someone to dance. You can explain the basic steps, but each dancer is different. A good instructor has to be able to read their student and adjust accordingly. The solution came from an unexpected source. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, a young officer who had been observing Margaret's training sessions, suggested breaking the approach down into recognizable patterns rather than rigid procedures. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Chen said during one of their planning sessions, "instead of trying to script every interaction, what if we identify the most common problems and give instructors a toolkit of responses?" Margaret's eyes lit up. "That's exactly right. We can teach instructors to recognize when a soldier is overthinking, or when they're too tense, or when they're lacking confidence. Then we give them specific techniques for addressing each problem." Working with Lieutenant Chen and a team of military psychologists, Margaret began developing what would become known as the Thompson method of marksmanship training. The system identified 7 common psychological barriers to accurate shooting and provided multiple techniques for addressing each. 1. The first barrier was overanalysis. Soldiers who thought too much about technique instead of trusting their instincts. For these soldiers, instructors learned to use distraction techniques, having them focus on external targets or engage in conversation while shooting. The second barrier was performance anxiety. Soldiers who became tense when they felt evaluated. For these soldiers, instructors learned to create practice environments that felt non-threatening, removing scoreboards and formal evaluation until confidence was rebuilt. The third barrier was perfectionism. Soldiers who became frustrated with anything less than perfect shots. For these soldiers, instructors learned to emphasize improvement over perfection, celebrating small gains rather than demanding immediate excellence. The fourth barrier was competitive pressure. Soldiers who became so focused on outperforming their peers that they lost focus on their own shooting. For these soldiers, instructors learned to emphasize personal improvement and team support rather than individual competition. The fifth barrier was negative self-talk. Soldiers who had developed mental habits of criticizing their own performance. For these soldiers, instructors learned techniques for building positive mental dialogue and confidence. The sixth barrier was physical tension. Soldiers who carried stress in their muscles that interfered with smooth shooting motions. For these soldiers, instructors learned simple relaxation techniques and physical exercises. The seventh barrier was loss of natural rhythm. Soldiers who had become so focused on following prescribed timing that they had lost their natural shooting cadence. For these soldiers, instructors learned to help them rediscover their own optimal timing and breathing patterns. As the Thompson method took shape, Margaret began training a core group of instructors who would eventually teach the new approach to others. The training was intensive, requiring instructors to unlearn many of their previous assumptions about how marksmanship should be taught. The breakthrough moment came during a demonstration for visiting Pentagon officials. Margaret had selected 12 of the soldiers who had shown the most improvement under her guidance, including Sergeant Rodriguez, who had become one of her most enthusiastic supporters. The demonstration began with the soldiers shooting using traditional military methods. Their scores were typical of what had been seen for months, mediocre at best with several complete misses. Then, using the Thompson method, the same soldiers shot again. The improvement was dramatic and immediate. Average scores increased by over 40%, and several soldiers achieved perfect or near-perfect scores. More importantly, the soldiers looked confident and relaxed, enjoying their shooting rather than dreading it. The 6-month trial period proved to be the most challenging time of Margaret Thompson's life. She found herself traveling constantly between Fort Benning in Georgia, Camp Pendleton in California, and Fort Bragg in North Carolina, working 18-hour days to train instructors and implement the Thompson method at 3 very different military installations. Each base presented unique challenges that tested the flexibility and universality of Margaret's approach. Fort Benning was training raw recruits with no previous shooting experience. Camp Pendleton was working with experienced Marines who had developed bad habits over years of service. Fort Bragg was preparing elite soldiers for special operations missions, where marksmanship could mean the difference between life and death. At Fort Benning, Margaret discovered that her methods worked even better with complete beginners than with experienced soldiers who had to unlearn previous training. Young recruits who had never held a rifle before seemed to naturally embrace the relaxed, instinctive approach she advocated. Within weeks, these new soldiers were outperforming veterans who had been shooting for years. Master Sergeant Jim Collins, the head marksmanship instructor at Fort Benning, was initially skeptical of training recruits without the rigid discipline that had been standard for decades. "Ma'am," he told Margaret during her first week at the base, "these boys need structure and discipline. If we let them get too relaxed, they'll lose the military bearing that keeps them alive in combat." Margaret understood his concern, but she had learned to address this issue during her time at Camp Perry. "Sergeant Collins, discipline and relaxation aren't opposites. A disciplined soldier is one who can perform effectively under pressure. If we teach these men to shoot well when they're calm and confident, they'll be much more likely to shoot well when they're scared and under fire." To prove her point, Margaret arranged a special exercise. Half of the recruits were trained using traditional methods with constant emphasis on following exact procedures and maintaining rigid posture. The other half were trained using the Thompson method, with emphasis on natural movement and instinctive shooting. After 4 weeks of training, both groups were subjected to a stress test designed to simulate combat conditions. The recruits were required to shoot while physical trainers shouted at them, while firecrackers exploded nearby, and while they were physically exhausted from running obstacle courses. The results were conclusive. The soldiers, trained with the Thompson method, maintained much higher accuracy under stress than those trained with traditional methods. "I don't understand it," Sergeant Collins admitted to Margaret. "Everything I was taught says that rigid discipline should produce better results under pressure." "Sergeant," Margaret replied, "rigid training produces rigid soldiers. But combat isn't rigid. Combat is chaotic and unpredictable. Soldiers who have learned to trust their instincts and adapt to changing conditions will always outperform soldiers who can only follow memorized procedures." At Camp Pendleton, Margaret faced a different challenge. The Marines there were experienced marksmen who had developed their own individual techniques over years of service. Many were resistant to changing methods that had worked for them in the past. Gunnery Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, no relation to the Sergeant Rodriguez from Camp Perry, was particularly difficult to convince. She was a decorated veteran who had served in combat and had strong opinions about what worked and what didn't. "Mrs. Thompson," Gunny Rodriguez said bluntly, "I've been shooting since before you started thinking about marksmanship training. My Marines hit their targets because they're disciplined and they follow proven techniques. I don't see why we need to fix something that isn't broken." Margaret realized that she needed a different approach with experienced shooters. Instead of trying to replace their existing skills, she focused on helping them optimize what they already knew. She showed them how small adjustments in their mental approach could improve their already excellent shooting. The breakthrough came when Margaret worked with Corporal Jennifer Walsh, a sniper who was considered one of the best shots in her unit, but was struggling with consistency. Some days Walsh could hit targets at impossible distances. Other days she missed shots that should have been routine. "Corporal," Margaret said after observing Walsh's shooting for several sessions, "you have excellent technique, but I notice that your performance varies based on your mood and stress level. What if we could find a way to help you access your best shooting state more consistently?" Margaret guided Walsh through exercises designed to help her recognize the mental and physical sensations associated with her best shooting performances. She taught Walsh how to recreate those optimal states deliberately, rather than waiting for them to occur naturally. The results were dramatic. Walsh's shooting became not just more accurate, but more consistent. More importantly, other Marines began to take notice. If the Thompson method could make their best shooter even better, maybe there was something to it after all. At Fort Bragg, Margaret faced her ultimate test. The special operations soldiers there were the elite of the elite, men who would be conducting the most dangerous and demanding missions the military had to offer. They needed to be able to shoot accurately under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Colonel Robert Harrison, the commanding officer of the Special Operations Training Unit, was a no-nonsense professional who had little patience for unproven methods. "Mrs. Thompson," he said during their first meeting, "my men's lives depend on their marksmanship skills. I can't afford to experiment with their training unless I'm absolutely certain your methods will make them more effective, not less." Margaret understood the stakes. These soldiers would be operating behind enemy lines. often in situations where a single missed shot could compromise an entire mission and endanger American lives. They needed to be perfect marksmen, capable of hitting their targets under any conditions. The Special Operations soldiers presented unique challenges. They were already excellent marksmen. They were used to operating under extreme stress, and they were naturally skeptical of anything that seemed to make their training easier rather than harder. Captain Mike Stevens, a veteran of multiple Special Operations missions, expressed the sentiment of many of his fellow soldiers. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we're used to training being hard. Making things easier makes us soft, and soft soldiers get killed in the field." Margaret realized that she needed to reframe her approach for this audience. "Captain, I'm not trying to make your training easier. I'm trying to make it more effective. The goal isn't to reduce the challenge. It's to help you perform better under that challenge." She began working with small groups of Special Operations soldiers, focusing on advanced applications of the Thompson method. Instead of basic relaxation techniques, she taught them how to achieve optimal shooting states while under extreme physical and psychological stress. Instead of simple confidence-building exercises, she helped them develop unshakable mental focus that could be maintained even in life-or-death situations. The training was intense and demanding, but it produced remarkable results. Soldiers who were already shooting at the 95th percentile began consistently performing at the 99th percentile or higher. More importantly, their shooting remained consistently excellent, even when they were physically exhausted, emotionally stressed, or operating under combat simulations that would have degraded the performance of traditionally trained marksmen. Word of the success at all three installations began to spread throughout the military establishment. Reports came back to the Pentagon showing dramatic improvements in marksmanship scores, reduced training time requirements, and higher soldier satisfaction with their shooting abilities. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from an unexpected source. Veterans of recent combat operations began reporting that soldiers trained with the Thompson method were performing significantly better in actual firefights than soldiers trained with traditional methods. The new training wasn't just producing better range scores, it was saving lives in real combat situations. As the 6-month trial period drew to a close, Margaret found herself summoned back to the Pentagon for a final evaluation. General Blackwood and a panel of senior military officers would review all the data from the 3 test installations and decide whether the Thompson method would be adopted, military-wide or quietly abandoned. Margaret knew that this meeting would determine not just the future of her training methods, but possibly the fate of thousands of American soldiers who would depend on their marksmanship skills in future conflicts. Everything she had worked for over the past months would be decided in a single presentation to men who had the power to transform military training or dismiss her efforts as an interesting but impractical experiment. The Pentagon briefing room was more intimidating than anything Margaret Thompson had ever faced. Sitting across from her were 12 of the most senior officers in the United States military, men whose decisions affected the lives of millions of soldiers around the world. General Blackwood sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the thick folders of data that had been compiled from the 6-month trial. Margaret wore her best dress, the same navy blue one she had worn to church for the past 5 years, and carried the worn leather briefcase that Robert had given her for Christmas. She felt completely out of place in this room of power and authority, but she also felt a quiet confidence in what she had accomplished. "Mrs. Thompson," General Blackwood began, "we've reviewed the data from all 3 test installations, and I have to say the results are quite remarkable. Marksmanship scores improved by an average of 42% across all units. Training time was reduced by 30%. And perhaps most importantly, soldier satisfaction and confidence increased dramatically." He paused and looked directly at Margaret. "But numbers only tell part of the story. What we really need to understand is whether these improvements will translate into better performance in actual combat situations." Colonel Harrison from Fort Bragg leaned forward. "General, I can speak to that question. We had an opportunity to test soldiers trained with the Thompson method during a recent classified operation in Southeast Asia. Without going into details I can't discuss, I can say that their marksmanship performance under extreme combat stress exceeded anything we had seen from traditionally trained soldiers." General Blackwood nodded. "That's encouraging, but I want to hear from Mrs. Thompson herself. Can you explain in simple terms why your methods work when traditional training has failed? Margaret took a deep breath. General, the military has always understood that soldiers need to be physically prepared for combat. You train them to be strong, fast, and tough. But somehow, when it comes to marksmanship, the military forgot that mental preparation is just as important as physical preparation. She stood up and walked to the whiteboard at the front of the room. Traditional marksmanship training focuses entirely on technique, stance, grip, sight alignment, trigger control. These are all important, but they're just tools. The question is, who's using the tools? A relaxed, confident soldier who trusts his instincts, or a tense, overthinking soldier who's afraid of making a mistake? Margaret drew a simple diagram showing two soldiers. When we train soldiers using traditional methods, we're essentially teaching them to override their natural abilities with memorized procedures. We're turning them into shooting robots instead of skilled marksmen. But surely discipline and standardized procedures are important in military training, interjected General Patricia Williams, the highest-ranking woman in the room. Absolutely, Margaret agreed. But there's a difference between disciplined training and rigid training. The Thompson method maintains military discipline while allowing natural shooting ability to flourish. We're not making training easier. We're making it more effective. General Blackwood studied the data in front of him. Mrs. Thompson, implementing your methods across the entire military would require retraining thousands of instructors and revising decades of established doctrine. That's an enormous undertaking. How do we know it will work consistently across different units and different types of soldiers? Margaret returned to her seat. General, that's exactly what we tested over the past 6 months. The method worked with raw recruits at Fort Benning, experienced Marines at Camp Pendleton, and elite Special Operations soldiers at Fort Bragg. It worked with soldiers from different backgrounds, different skill levels, and different military specialties. But what about instructors? Asked Major General Robert Chen. Not every marksmanship instructor has your intuitive understanding of shooting psychology. How do we ensure consistent implementation? Margaret smiled. General, that was the hardest part of this entire project. But we solved it by creating a systematic training program for instructors. We identified the most common problems that interfere with good shooting, and we gave instructors specific tools for addressing each problem. An instructor doesn't need to be a psychologist. They just need to recognize patterns and know which techniques to apply. Colonel Mitchell, who had been quietly observing the meeting, spoke up. Generals, I've worked with Mrs. Thompson from the beginning of this project. I can tell you that her training program for instructors is thorough and effective. We've already trained over 50 instructors at Camp Perry, and they're achieving results that match what Mrs. Thompson accomplished personally. General Blackwood looked around the table at his fellow officers. Are there any other concerns or questions about implementing the Thompson method? General Williams raised her hand. I have one concern. This approach seems to rely heavily on individual adaptation and personal attention. How do we maintain that quality when we scale up to train hundreds of thousands of soldiers? Margaret had anticipated this question. General, that's where the instructor training becomes crucial. We teach instructors to recognize individual differences and adapt their methods accordingly. It's not about giving every soldier identical training. It's about giving every soldier the type of training that works best for them. And the cost? Asked General Blackwood. Actually lower than traditional training, Margaret replied. Because soldiers learn faster and retain their skills longer. We need fewer training hours to achieve better results. The initial investment in instructor retraining pays for itself within the first year. The room fell silent as the generals considered everything they had heard. Margaret could feel her heart beating as she waited for their decision. Everything she had worked for, everything that could benefit American soldiers for generations to come, depended on what these men decided in the next few minutes. Finally, General Blackwood spoke. Mrs. Thompson, on behalf of the United States military, I want to thank you for your service to our country. What you've accomplished is nothing short of revolutionary. He paused, and Margaret felt her stomach tighten. We've decided to implement the Thompson method as the standard marksmanship training protocol for all branches of the military. Effective immediately, the room erupted in a mixture of applause and excited discussion. Margaret felt tears welling up in her eyes as the magnitude of the decision hit her. Her quiet insights from a farm in Ohio were about to become the foundation of military training for the most powerful armed forces in the world. Mrs. Thompson, General Blackwood continued, We'd like to offer you a position as Special Advisor for Marksmanship Training, reporting directly to the Pentagon. Your job would be to oversee the implementation of your methods and continue developing improvements to military training. Margaret was overwhelmed by the offer, but she knew her answer immediately. General, I'm honored by your offer, but I think my job here is done. You have excellent instructors who understand the Thompson method better than I do now. What you need going forward isn't an advisor. It's leadership that believes in the approach and gives instructors the support they need to implement it properly. She stood up and gathered her papers. I'm just a farm wife from Ohio who happened to understand something about shooting. The real heroes are the instructors and soldiers who trusted me enough to try something different. They're the ones who deserve the credit for what we've accomplished. As Margaret left the Pentagon that day, she knew that her life would never be the same. But she also knew that thousands of American soldiers would be better prepared for the challenges they would face. And that was all that really mattered to her. 6 months later, reports began coming in from combat zones around the world. American soldiers were outperforming enemy marksmen by margins that military leaders had never seen before. The Thompson method had not only solved the marksmanship crisis, it had given American forces a significant tactical advantage. Margaret Thompson returned to her quiet life in Ohio, tending her garden and helping Robert with the dairy farm. But she never forgot the soldiers she had trained, and they never forgot the unassuming woman who had taught them to trust themselves and shoot with confidence. The military's marksmanship scores remained at record highs for decades, and the Thompson method became the foundation for training programs that saved countless lives in conflicts around the world. Sometimes the most revolutionary changes come not from experts or officials, but from ordinary people who see problems clearly and have the courage to speak up. Margaret Thompson proved that wisdom doesn't always come from expected sources, and that the right insight at the right time can change the course of history.